From Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 45. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and Jesus was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. Being stuck can make us feel very uncomfortable. If someone says they're stuck at their job, that means they want to get out. They want to do something different, but don't feel like they can. It's a negative feeling. Sometimes if someone gets stuck at an airport, you can see some of their nastiest sides come out as they yell at flight attendants trying to help them make different flights to get where they're wanting to go. They don't like being stuck. If you're stuck in traffic, I know I've been known to wheel off to the side and take back roads and do all kinds of things that make the trip go on much, much longer in order to avoid having to sit still in a line of cars and be stuck. Being stuck is not something that we tend to ascribe much value to, and we tend to view it as something that's quite negative. And so this story of Jesus walking on the water might strike us as a little bit strange. Because here's Jesus, he has sent those disciples off to cross the Sea of Galilee, and he's had some alone time to himself to pray up on the mountain, and he sees that out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, the disciples are rowing against an unfavorable wind. And so essentially, they're rowing and the wind is blowing back, and so they're fastly going nowhere. And Jesus walks out on the water, which, is standard Jesus, amazing miracle, kind of understated as Mark tells it. And Jesus walks out on the water, and Mark gives us a little bit of psychological insight into Jesus here. He says that Jesus intended to pass them by. Jesus sees the disciples in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and his intention is not to deliver them from being stuck, but instead to go past them. Why in the world would Jesus see his friends, these disciples, stuck and intend to pass them by? It's an interesting question. It's an intriguing passage, isn't it? Well, we ascribe to being stuck the sense of being uncomfortable. It's something that if you're stuck, you generally want that experience. Whatever you're stuck in, you want it to end. And yet Jesus doesn't seem to think that being stuck is something that he has an urgency to end. Being stuck sometimes, even though it makes us uncomfortable, isn't necessarily such a bad thing. To be uncomfortable isn't something that always leads us to negative destinations. Instead, sometimes when we're uncomfortable, it's exactly that which helps us to grow. It helps us to become better. Nobody feels comfortable, or few people anyway, feel comfortable raising a topic of conflict with someone. A lot of times people will, instead of having a conflictual conversation with someone, they'll instead bury those feelings and avoid having that hard talk. But being uncomfortable and having a hard talk can actually lead us to a better place. It's uncomfortable to apologize. I remember one time in high school, I did something stupid and put my friends in danger. And my parents had this brilliant idea that I needed to call their parents and apologize. And I remember thinking, wouldn't you do that for me, please? Wouldn't you make that call, please? This is not comfortable. I don't want to do that. Couldn't you, Mom and Dad, just call and tell them how sorry I am? And they would not let me do that. And I remember distinctly that sense of discomfort. And yet I grew from it. It was holy to have to be uncomfortable. Reading the Bible can be that way. We can open up the scriptures and find that the words of the Bible can call us out. They can make challenges of us that we would just as soon not rise to. But being uncomfortable isn't a bad thing in and of itself. And so even as Jesus walks by and sees the disciples stuck and knows that they're not where they want to be, his intention to pass them by is actually something that could be quite beautiful because it leaves them in an uncomfortable position. Now, that uncomfortable position of being stuck is very inefficient. We might read this story and judge Jesus on the basis of efficiency. He could have been very more intentional about how he used his disciples. Why would he set them up to go out into the middle of the sea and toil inefficiently? He could have kept them on his side of the shore and had them deal with the people that had been there. He could have sent them on ahead and help them get through that storm or the winds and get to the other side so they could set up camp efficiently and have everything ready for them, or go ahead and do some work for him on the other side. But instead, he has them toil inefficiently. And yet you have to ask yourself, well, whose efficiency are we talking about? What is the efficiency of the task that is at hand? Sure, they could have crossed to the other side more quickly, but would that have necessarily made them more efficient? Efficient at what? Maybe the efficiency that Jesus was looking for wasn't for them to cross the sea efficiently. Maybe what Jesus was looking for was for them to have time in the boat without him, in which case that storm would have provided the perfect opportunity for them to have a nice long boat trip instead of a road trip together. Sometimes what we think is the purpose of something is actually something entirely different. And so when we judge things according to efficiency, we don't always have that best standard. You could judge a doctor's visit on the basis of efficiency and say, hey, a doctor should be able to have a quick in and out to explain the results of a test and move on and see more patients in a day. And if making more money on the basis of having a number of patients was the purpose of medicine, then yes, that would be wonderful. But if you have sat in the seat with a doctor who is explaining results to you and you have questions and you want to have time to hear answers and continue to ask questions and have a relationship with the doctor, you know that efficiency of time isn't always the best way to judge what a doctor does. Recently, our church has engaged in some partnership with a church across town, Koinonia Christian Fellowship. That partnership is an intentional one. Last summer, in the midst of so much racial animosity and stress, Bishop Rosie and I, along with our Nicole Franklin and their Tracy Hutchins, began a friendship and began to spend some time together and get to know each other. And so a team of some folks from St. James and some folks from Koinonia have gotten together this summer. And they began to plan what we're calling Summer Slam, which really was begun with very little time and not the way that we at St. James typically would seek to engage in making for a project. And purpose of this thing, of course, is to bless teachers, educators, and schools by providing an opportunity for fellowship and celebration and appreciation and even some funding for schools. And if the sole purpose of this was to fulfill that goal, then absolutely we've rushed this thing. We should have waited and had a long planning session. But honestly, part of the purpose of doing something like this was to forge friendships. And, honestly, nothing really forges friendships like jumping into a pot together and trying to figure something out. And so we've seen some of the fruit of this project. While we want the event that's going to happen next Saturday to be beautiful and marvelous, already this process, which could be judged as inefficient on some grounds, is quite efficient. The friendships are being forged, and time together with friends from a church that's predominantly African American and a church that's predominantly Anglo-American or white American, we're finding is already happening. And so sometimes we might judge something on an efficiency that's the wrong efficiency. Of course, time is something that we tend to hold up as being a valued thing. And so you could look at the disciples sitting out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, rowing against the wind as a waste of time. And yet time is something that we ought to look at with a little bit different perspective. We tend to view time as this commodity, as something that is meant to be limited and meant to be spent only in certain ways. And yet God's perspective on time is a little different than human perspective on time. Recently, a group of us have been making our way through the book of Ecclesiastes, and there's a passage in there that we know we have heard often preached on and recited. It's one of those kind of famous passages. It's chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to sow, a time to reap, et cetera, et cetera. And those time passages are ones that we know well, but outside of those passages, there's some other passages in Ecclesiastes that deal with time. And just after that famous time passage is this one. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. God's sense of time is so much bigger than our sense of time. And so there are times where we are in the midst of something that can seem frustrating. It can seem like we're stuck. And yet from God's eternal perspective, what can seem as if it can stretch for us, it can seem like we're stuck in something that can stretch for eternity, God's perspective on it is different. We can't fathom what God has done from beginning to end. And so sometimes when we are stuck in something that can feel like a waste of time, we need to put on our spectacles of eternity, our eternity that's been placed in our hearts, and see it differently. There are times where we can feel like something is so big we'll be stuck forever. I one time went spelunking. I was exploring a cave, and as part of that exploration, went off by myself for a minute and crawled down into a tunnel. And it was time to leave that tunnel. And so I started to try to crawl out. And it was muddy, and I kept sliding. I couldn't get out. It was terrifying. I had this like image of my bones, dried out from being stuck in this cave for millennia. I had this fear that I would never, ever be able to get out. Now, truthfully, I was there. My father was there, and a guide was there, and I couldn't see them, but I know that if I had yelled loud enough, they would have come to help me. Just like when the disciples in that boat were afraid, Jesus climbed in that boat and made the winds stop. But I also know that experience of being stuck has stuck with me. And that while I could have yelled for help, that sensation of being stuck, the fear that I felt was formative, but also as I really dug in and as I put everything that I had into climbing out, that was important for me too. to remember that determination meant something. Time, feeling stuck, fearing that something will stretch forever, is a real thing. And yet, if we put on our spectacles of eternity, we remember that God's time is different, and that God's perspective on what may seem to us to stretch forever is very different. We can be like children on a road trip, and after a few miles saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" That's how we are. God's perspective on time it stretches bigger, and we've been given the gift of being able to see time through that eternal perspective. Now, Jesus walked by these disciples, and he intended to pass them by. We will never know truly what Jesus intended, why he intended that, because of course he was seen and they were afraid, and Jesus comforted their fear and got in that boat with them and helped them to be able to row with the wind instead of against the wind. We'll never know what might have awaited for them on the far shore. We'll never know what Jesus may have intended for them to learn, how he intended for them to grow as he intended to walk by them. This week, you and I will find ourselves stuck. It may be a little sense of stuck. We might be stuck in a waiting room. We might be stuck in a line. We might be stuck in traffic. It may be a big kind of stuck. We might find ourselves stuck in something bigger, stuck in depression, stuck in not knowing where to go next. Wherever we are stuck, whether it be something big or something small, perhaps Jesus has an intention for us. Rather than rushing through, perhaps we can pause in whatever it is which we find ourselves stuck and ask, what might the Lord intend for us in this moment? Amen.